At the end of December 2023, articles appeared on specialized news sites about 18-year-old British hacker Aryan Kurtaj, who was affiliated with the hacker group Lapsus. He attracted attention by carrying out a cyber attack on Rockstar Games, hacking and stealing at least 19 videos files containing footage of GTA 6. Additionally, it should be noted that the young hacker Aryan suffered from acute autism. Wherever. Overall, the entire year of 2023 was marked by numerous daring hacker attacks, such as the news of the theft of the Stalker 2 prototype in the spring of that year. As a result, 16 GB of stolen data were leaked online, including personal data of GSC employees. Russian perpetrators used this information to discredit the Ukrainian gaming company by issuing strikes on their compatriots' channel in the name of someone like Mr. Holubnichi. It was quite an interesting clash, typical of their style, but today is not about that. Why did I decide to start the video with the story about the British hacker? Because after Kurtaj compromising action, sometime later, specifically in early April 2024, someone named GameHead leaked a development prototype of the game Manhunt with the build number 069B, although the prototype itself listed it as 067. Personally, I found out about this about a week later, as video showcasing playthroughs and demonstration of this prototype began appearing on YouTube around mid-April. What was particularly interesting was that the prototype existed as an image that worked on the PlayStation 2 console BIOS. However, at first both the news about this release and the topic of the prototype in general did not particularly interested me. As a well-known manhuntologist in some small circles, it seems to me that this prototype did not contain any interesting information regarding its content. However, on April, someone named Mr. Danilo provided me with a patched image of that very prototype, along with a subtle comment. At that moment, I realized that this was a pretty good reason to return to Carcer City and see what Manhunt looked like 6 months before its release. Moreover, the core audience of Valiant Video would probably be interested in such a somewhat analytical review of this prototype with commentary. This is something I can't say with certainty about new and moderately regular viewers. So, hello! I still hope you find this story interesting. And if you're already intrigued, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the like button under this video. This time, just like always, I've been wandering the streets of Carcer City and capturing everything possible. Enjoy the video. So, as I mentioned earlier, the prototype was created to run the game on PlayStation 2. And since I don't have that console, it's possible to run this build through an appropriate emulator. I admit, until this point I had never dealt with emulators. However, it turned out to be quite simple. Unpacking, launching the application and specifying the required image for playback. Upon launching, the game displays a combined studio logo, a vintage Rockstar Games video card from the GTA 3 era, an unexpected logo of the studio's former name, and the logo of the renderware game engine, licensed by Electronic Arts. At the start, the prototype offers to choose a difficult level, and of course I traditionally choose hard mode. So this is what the menu looks like. The first thing I do is go to the bonus materials tab and find a blank screen, which is not surprising for a prototype. Next, I head to the settings, where you can save and load game progress. It's worth nothing that all the slots were occupied. Nothing could be saved or loaded from them. All the save files are dated May 2003, which confirms the existing information that this prototype builds date back to May 13, 2003. There are also typical settings for difficult, language, video, including overall brightness level, and type and level of sound playback. The next tab in the main menu is for selecting a game scene, or in other words, a level. Just like in the original, they are 21 game scenes distributed across 6 tabs. Jumping ahead, this is the menu from which you can continue your game progress, because if you press play in the main menu, the game will always start the first level. In the scene selection menu, this first level is called Jury Turf. This is an interesting detail. From generally known information, this game area is called Hood Turf. Additionally, in the early stages, the enemy in these levels were supposed to be a gang called the Jury. or jury. Information about them can be found in the original Manhunt, and their concepts served as the basis for the creating the Skins gang in the Denton scrapyard. However, when we launch the level Jury Turf, the loading screens indicates that is the actually called Hoods Turf. This aligns with the original game and the current prototype, where the gang present in the hoods. Interestingly, before each level, this image is displayed along with a creepy melody. The first level, as in the release version, begins with a cutscenes featuring slightly different camera angles, different director's text, and, as it seems to me, a different voice of the director. It appears to be a rough draft of the voiceover, and most likely it was not Brian Cox who voiced Starkweather in the original game.
The streets are being patrolled by gangs. The scum, just like you, and they're here to hunt you down and cut you up. Remember, as far as the world's concerned, you're dead already, so don't hold back.
The first noticeable difference from the original game is, of course, the model of James Cash, which here looks according to its beta prototype. Also, there's quite an inaccurate representation of light sources, which can shine, fog, textures and collision. Well, overall, I won't regularly draw attention to somewhat clumsy animation and the general appearance of level, because you can see it for yourself. And here, the focus should be on gameplay. Structurally, the majority of levels have the same layout as in the original, with some unique cases that remain specific to the prototype. So, how's the gameplay? Firstly, the start system here lacks gradation from brutal to gruesome. It only has one preset animation. Secondly, starts are triggered only by cross button, which is responsible for the standard attack in directed counters. Whereas in the original you could activate a start with the square button. Thirdly, the direct confrontation seemed somewhat simplified to me, even though practically every initial enemy attack is accompanied by a grab. However, the simplicity lies in the fact that I was able to almost always abuse the enemy with a spam of heavy attack to knock them down. Not always, but more often than not. Next, while traversing the parking lot in front of the mall, I noticed that VHS distortion during starts were not displayed, which was oddly good. Then I started having adventures with the local artificial intelligence and the overall behavior of enemies. Unlike the original, there were 3 enemies in this segment, and now, just like in the Blood Moon mod, enemies can converge on gems all at once within an audible range. Adding to this, the rather high alertness of the hunter and the increased hardcore experience is guaranteed. However, on the third attempts, during the abuse of heavy attacks in the spar, the audibility somehow didn't work as in previous attempts. The postal chute was opened, I jumped into it, and I saw level statistic, which correctly displayed only the optimal completion time, classifying me as an amateur. Thank you. Information regarding starts and kills in the prototype overall isn't calculated. And if you press the cross button to continue the game after this, the prototype playback freezes. Therefore, it's advisable to exit to the menu after completing the level or restart the image, which is what I did. The next level is titled Derelict Prison, and essentially it represents and repeats what was almost in the original release. Here, this also is seen with a P-boy and the condition of finding the crowbar to progress further through the level. Among the differences, there is a cool transition through the VHS effect and the rather simple condition for obtaining the crowbar. Unlike the original, there's no suspense here, and it's just lying in the room. Also, the return path turns out to be simpler, because when returning to the gates, we only encounter one capturer as an obstacle. This somewhat struck me, because after we are asked to take out a brawler with bats, and James defeats this brute, the level doesn't end, but succinctly continues with the next scene, which is uncharacteristic in the original, but oh well. At this point, I encountered some peculiarities regarding the AI and detection. Similar episodes were perceived as exceptions, and I attributed it to the prototype nature, but later there were more of such quirks. Overall, the further progression through the level coincided with the original incarnation, except for the final segment. Here, all the hoods did not patrol the basement area and more or less stayed in this position. Instead, they purposefully headed towards the entrance to the library through the basement. I, of course, took advantage of this gameplay loophole and make my escape to complete this combined scene. The next scene was my first moment of confusion regarding what the game actually wanted from me. The scene is called Zoo Weasel, or simply Weasel, and it has a rather amusing loading screen. This level represents a rook draft of the bonus scenes from the original Time to Die, where you had to clear the level within a certain time limit. However, in the initial cutscene here, the emphasis was on very fast hunters, which, as it turned out, there were more of later on. So, armed with this information and previous experience from the original, I assumed that the level would be completed if I completely cleared it. I must say I attempted this 3 times. In total, I spent about an hour and a half in this scene, trying to kill every single enemy. To my surprise, the enemy never seemed to end. Then I came up with another assumption. I needed to kill all the fast enemies whom I started calling ferrets or weasels, but even that didn't help. Also, consider that there were many hiding spots in the level, with the most tactically advantageous spots being the 3rd floor textureless room, where I lured the hunters and executed strats. At some point I noticed that during the ascent to this location, the running animation of the enemies would sometimes lag, which I happily took advantage of. Man, in this scene I killed about 30 hoods in one attempt, which is quite a lot for an average level in Manhunt, where there are no segments with firearms. It's worth nothing that in my attempts to wipe out the entire enemy population, I understood why the level was called Weasel and the concept behind these fast enemies. It turns out that these runners are indeed akin to weasels. Once, while I was hiding in the shadows to take out a hood, one of these ferrets exposed my hiding spots, revealing my position to everyone. And in some cases, I found these runners hiding in the shadow themselves, which struck me as a very cool mechanic for an enemy in Manhunt. After all, the weasel, according to the description of this animal, typically moves swiftly and relentlessly, exploding all the nooks and crannies along its regular hunting routes. Similarly, these enemies NPCs behaved accordingly. My adventures on this level came to an end when one of the Stax hoodies crashed the game, forcing the emulator to shut down completely. Considering that I had spent the maximum amount of time on this level compared to other scenes, I really didn't want to repeat this experience. However, on Daniel Gaming channels, I watched at the outer decided to check the original completion condition of Time to Die and run to the final trigger of the level, thereby completing it. From this, I assume that the purpose of the scenes is to survive for a certain period without being detected by the weasels, who roam the level in search of James. It's a cool concept for a scenes, but unfortunately the conditions are not explained in this prototype. The next 2 sections, despite being labeled as Zoo and Sever in the scene selection menu, just like in the original game, repeat the plots of the original White Trash and fuel it by hate levels. However, there are some differences. For example, even though Section 1 starts as White Trash and develops similarly, it first demonstrates a rather obvious secret, thanks to which you can obtain the nail gun almost at the beginning of the scene. This significantly facilitates the progression through the level. Secondly, it provides him with some unbalanced amount of ammunition. As for curiosities, I'll note that the scene also features the situation with the shitmaker, who speaks surprisingly with innocent lines.
Negra, watch over me!
Also, the sounds of the nail gun shot itself sounds more characteristic of firearm than some chimera building tool. Now, the second section had more interesting aspects. The first one was the noticeable increase in aggression and vigilance of the local skins. Their visual variations, as you may have noticed, is represented by just one model. This indicates that the concept of the jury gang, with their characteristic hockey mask, hadn't been used yet for designing the rest of the skin models. However, the complete obliviousness of the neo-Nazis was quite noticeable. Occasionally, they seemed to bug out, forgetting about me even if they spotted me in the shadows. Additionally, I encountered instances of reverse abuse of the strong attack. Another difference was the completion condition of the episodic involving the crane. Here you also had to find a fuel canister and take it not to the crane, but to the generator powering the doors. Apart from that, there weren't any significant differences until the subsequent episode with the second set of doors, where all 5 skins were armed with nail guns, significantly complicating progression. However, after that, James only had to deal with 1 militia skin, easily dispatched, and the completion condition remained unchanged. The next scene is set in the shopping mall. Instead of the action-packed episode in the original, the prototype presents a rather eerie and, dare I say, horror-themed story. The suspense revolves around James needing to find the key to the pet store. The shopping center itself turned out to be empty and desolate. James navigates through this rather liminal space, where the scenes of eerie loneliness is heightened by contextual scenes hinting that he is definitely not alone. As the explorer's familiar, albeit sometimes altered, interiors of the shopping models, James must find a knife on the 3rd floor to gain access to the bar. But in my case, the knife didn't spawn. I went to see how it was in Daniel's playthrough, and he had the knife in place. So I got into the bar using cheats. There on the pool table was a distorted corpse, in the pocket of which was the needed key. When James entered the pet store, he first found a stylized voodoo doll, then scenes of occult behavior with cats. Ugh. And finally, he disrupted some ritual at the center of events involving the doll, which was interrupted by sudden satanist from among the innocents. And from approximately this point, this scene stopped working properly because, unlike Daniel's playthrough, the cradle on the 3rd floor where the doll was supposed to be placed didn't spawn for me. Moreover, Daniel himself couldn't finish this level, because the triggers for further story development were missing. This was evidenced by the basement location, where assets necessary for progression were found. After using cheats to get there, I found no spawned knife, cradle, or 2 more dolls, from which I concluded there might have been some ritual to perform during the course of this scene. However, as we know, the developers ultimately decided against such a horror experience. The next scenes after the mall is the church, which in the original is called something like drunk driving. And this is one of those scenes that will be almost literally reproduced in the original. Here we also needed to find Tramp and guide him through the districts of eastern Los Albos, through local landmarks such as the church, the construction site, and the cemetery. Differences here include the rook animation of the sickle execution, Trump holding a bottle in his hand, frustration from Trump's very slow movement, and the absence of the double-barreled shotgun, which was replaced here with something like SPAS 12. Overall, however, the scenes underwent minimal changes. By the way, the same characteristic features apply to the next scenes in the zoo, where the passage conditions are the same as in the original. However, there were some details added. Firstly, the crowbar for breaking the lock is located in the specific enclosure, which you don't need to disturb anyone to obtain. Secondly, in the hiding spots near the toilets, there is not a shotgun, but a tranquilizer gun. Thirdly, he doesn't sedate the war dogs, who speak lines similar to hoots. Instead, it affects them like a slightly enhanced version of the nail gun. However, the tranquilizer gun is capable of one-shooting an enemy with a headshot. But if the war dogs aim at James, it will be visually emphasized, and there will also be no opportunity to pick up items. By the way, similar passage conditions to the original are also inherent in the second section of the zoo with the working title Derelict. This is the same scene called Strap It for Cash. However, the passage condition in the prototype is fundamentally different. The storyline of rescuing relatives held hostage, as you may recall, is absent here. Instead, the prototype suggests sneaking past enemy hunters without any means of killing them. However, you still manage to acquire weapons, including firearms, and infiltrate the terrarium and pool area to notice some minor differences in the interior from the release version. and then complete this scene. Since the next level is actually unique for this prototype, the Pain Factory scene is probably the only unique prototype level that did not make it into the original Manhunt. The first thing that catches the eye is the presence of the first unique weapon, namely the spiked bat. The second thing that attracts attention is some level of direction. Here you can see a certain staging where gang members, smiling in the company of Trumps, suddenly are personally filming content for the director. Of course, James needed to kill as many of them as possible, which turns out not to be as difficult as it may seem at first, and activate the elevator power, which gradually should rise Cash to the top 3 floors to perform certain conditions there. And unlike the third and fourth floor, I couldn't pass the second floor without invisible cheat. The thing is, here you need to obtain a special card held by a lunatic, guarded by 3 others. The impossibility lies in the fact that you have to break though not stealthy, but through direct contact. Because of this I encountered certain difficulties and a feeling of impossibility of progressing, although at first it seems like everything was achievable. However, with the help of cheat, I discovered that the spiked bat does not have a struggle animation, but the ice pick does. On the third floor, you had to activate 3 signal horns to lure the maniacs out of the administrative office, where among several maniacs, there was one extremely dangerous individual carrying a revolver. By activating each klaxons and disposing of the maniacs, James finally approaches the shooter, who despite his danger, fortunately turns out to be a dumb-witted fool. Cash takes the pistol and heads to the 4th floor, where he only had to shoot everyone down. By the way, although I had received shotgun before, it was on this level that I noticed the cool animation for unfolding this weapon. Also, in the center of the floor, there were natural NPCs in the cage, whose model I had never encountered in studying some of the prototype materials for Manhunt. For example, I hoped that in the prototype I would find or see references to the Lost Gang, who were originally supposed to be James' enemies in the scrapyard. However, throughout my experience with the prototype, this model and the slightly different version of the familiar character actually surprised me and overshadowed some disappointment about the absence of the welder maniacs. In general, after this, the Pain Factory was supposed to end with a descent into the underground communications, but considering that this is an exclusive battle level, the scenes completing scripts was probably absent here. However, this battle level finally, in my opinion, was very succinctly linked to the next scene, which is supposed to take place at the chemical plant. Agree, this seems more pleasurable in terms of the overall movement between locations. Whereas in the original game, this scene starts after the escorting scenes with Trump. What can be said about the night shift in the prototype is that is an extremely unfinished and somewhat cursed scene. It somehow supernaturally lagged for me and didn't display the weapon. Overall, this scene look and plays out roughly the same as scenes in the junkyard and zoo, with some minor architectural changes. However, it should be noted that despite some incorrect rendering or certain assets, the level itself has a slightly different ending, including the level completion trigger. By the way, I can't say the same about the Asylum scene, which in its construction is a prototype of the original Mouth of Madness scene. At first everything plays and feels familiar, albeit with some balance issues and certain exterior decisions that add a touch of novelty. For example, the approach to the guard with a 6-shooter in the inner courtyard is absent. However, the final level trigger is present ahead of schedule. Interestingly, the level's incompleteness is somewhat demonstrated by the presence of a fuel canister here, which in the original was supposed to dismantle the wall of the watchtower. However, here you can only pick it up and place it. Overall, the conditions and culminations of the scenes remain unchanged, including the absence of level completion once again. The next scenes in the entire trilogy of the original Smiley Residence turn out to be the most refined and balanced for me. Firstly, this is the only instance of the modified sound accompaniment for the killer cut scene. I would love to listen to the full version of this melody. Secondly, the initial condition for progression here requires James to eliminate a certain number of war dogs. Unlike the original, this must be done using disposable means of elimination. So each time you have to find something new. Additionally, it seems to me that Block H had slightly altered planning, though this might have been my perception due to different progression conditions at the beginning. Overall, after the initial segment, this scene, in my opinion, hasn't undergone significant changes. However, it's worth noting that on the second floor of Block H, the cover and shooting system look quite unfinished. Nevertheless, the level remains stable, well balanced, and most importantly, it's passable. It's interesting that you mentioned the Kill the Rabbit scene, which is essentially the prototype version of the iconic level from the original Manhunt. At first glance, it looks, plays and feels very similar to how it's arranged in the release version. There are of course some differences in the episodes with the mass shooting of inmates, where you can turn off the lights in the prison block, which I assumed had some gameplay intention behind it.
What the fuck? Who messed with the light?
However, what was particularly frustrating was that after this gunpowder segment, the game somehow anomalously began to deny my progression. Time and again, I attempted to activate all the necessary triggers, but the prototype stubbornly refused to let me proceed. It got to the point where, with the help of cheats, I flew through and explored areas that were inaccessible by legitimate means, causing important scripts for the correct playback of the scene scenario not to trigger. But once again, I observed this is Daniel's playthrough, and I turned out that at the end of the level, just before the exit gate, you needed to shut the rabbit, which triggered the level completion script. The next scenes after Ramirez, as well as the one that comes after it, by the way, it seems at least interesting to me upon inspection. The scene itself represents a boss fight, during which we needed to deal with several of Ramirez's henchmen before taking down the boss himself. At first I didn't understand where he was hiding, guessing from the memory that, like in the original, he was probably in the high-rise building, coordinating his punitive squad. But, as it turned out, the architecture of the prototype level, although reminiscent of Divided the Fall, did not have a high-rise building or a spacious inner courtyard, and Ramirez himself, as it turned out, was handing out with his cronies. And here's what he looks like in the prototype, by the way. This guy just an animal, fuck. And of course, when we kill all the war dogs, just like in the original, Ramirez can be executed in the usual way. So here he has to be taken out more traditionally, head on. Fortunately, with the Spike's bats, it's not that difficult. Next up, we have a truly interesting level, unlike the original press coverage, where the role of the journalist is played by a neutral NPC model from the beta level Pain Factory. So I can say for sure that it was initially supposed to be a male journalist, but that's not what impressed me. What struck me was that when I entered into a direct confrontation with the cops, this journalist, despite orders or recommendations to hide, would come out and help me beat down the pharaohs. I honestly couldn't believe my eyes. Although the mere presence of such a detail, in my opinion, is very cool. Moreover, if the journalist came across a pistol as set, he would arm himself with it, which left me speechless. That is. According to the prototype's condition, James also have to escort the journalist to his secret office, where Cash had the opportunity to personally review the available materials regarding his enslavement in Mr. Nasty project, in Fairy Descent Resolution. However, after this moment, the subsequent scenes refused to work correctly. I went to check on Daniel again, and as it turned out, he also encountered a similar problem here. So, in the end, both he and I activated Noclip, checked that there was nothing interesting ahead, and went to launch the subway scene. Unlike me, Daniel's scene at least started. No matter how many times I tried to launch this scene, I could get it to work. So, all I could do was watching Daniel's playthrough. And you know what? Overall, this level seems to have undergone few changes to me, except for one detail, When Daniel, based on his memory, went to the train at the beginning of the level after restoring power to the tunnel, which shouldn't have been done because in the prototype a special trolley transported him to the next station. Other than that, the concessions were the same and the level ended correctly. Similar things are going in the next scene's train yard, which actually started for me. Essentially, it's the same level with the same condition, featuring intense shootout and survival challenges. The only differences from the original Manhunt that need to be emphasized in the presence of a police sniper, who behaved, to put it mildly, not according to his profession. Moreover, his position made it impossible to acquire the sniper rifle. As we may remember from the original game, behaving a scoped weapon significantly facilitated the final segment of this scene. I could feel this in the prototype as well. Perhaps the beta testers also highlighted this. Results in the rifle being placed in the carriage and the water tower with the sniper being removed altogether. Here. The next scenes, by the way, didn't start for me again. It even got to the point where I made a hardware save through the emulator, and all these attempts were unsuccessful. So, rightly, for the last time we turn to Daniel's video and reassure ourselves that we didn't miss much. The scene in the prototype has condition for progression and overall design similar to the original, with the only difference being the placement of some checkpoint tapes, but that's about it. The scene with the estate fortunately started for me, although it could have failed to do so for the same reasons as the previous scene, in terms of major differences. There are almost none here as well. However, some points should be noted. For example, the absence of the Cerberus Commander model, instead the popular model of Trump is displayed here. Also, the levels start crashing at some point. I began to check this using noclip, and it turned out that this was happening due to the incorrect loading of certain enemy models. But overall, the conditions for progression and completion in this scene are quite identical. So let's move to the juiciest and dirtiest part, that is the scene in the attic of Starkweather Mansion. The setup of the scenes and the subsequent boss fight generally look and play out quite similarly to the release version of Manhunt. Although keep in mind that the artificial intelligence of the pig and some other hunters on James can sometimes be unpredictable. However, for example, the spikes and glass shards are placed here just like in the original, so I didn't feel any particular difficulty in progression. What pleasantly surprised me personally is the presence of new, or rather unused, attack animations for James. Cash make a swing, Pixie parries it, starts at the saw, and at the moment Cash interferences with the shard into his stomach. It looks intriguing and brutal in my opinion. In general, you have to stop the pig 3 times for it to run away crying in horror. However, I admit, because of its somewhat unclear animation after the 3rd stab, I initially thought more stabs were required. It seems to me that the presence of additional attack items indicates something. I stood here, waiting, hitting the wall, and then I found the textureless chainsaw, which the fat belly of Satan left at the side of the less damage formation. To my surprise, the chainsaw didn't start it and only had animations for standard and heavy strikes similar to the spiked bat. However, the chainsaw was twice as powerful. I became convinced of this when I went to confront Pixie. He literally fell from 3 hits. As for him, he also looked very grotesque, and I couldn't help but notice he had a very oversized genitalia. But as they say, it's just a minor detail. Further progression through the level was blocked, so at first I thought that the scene's completion trigger might be somewhere in the previous area. With the help of noclip, I made my way through the textures and discovered that the attic had its continuation, just like in the original game. It even had some setup to stage Pixie's death, as it realized in the original game. The scene's completion trigger was located at the entrance to the director office. And at this point, the exploration of all the potentially interesting content presented in this prototype can be considered complete. In summary of all that has been said and shown, I can confidently state that despite all my previous bases regarding this prototype, this very prototype justified itself by a good 15%. My basis stemmed from the belief, I repeat, that hardly any prototype would show me something truly unique, something I didn't know. And although there were actually few things to surprise me, in the beta version of Manhunt numbered 067. Such as the entire beta scene with the Factory of Pain, a journalist who has the ability to provide assistance, and the beginning of an iteration mechanic of the hunter's fondness. In the end, the prototype contained the content that I generally expected to the practically see in it, namely the absence of any musical accompaniment, both new and old, jackal-like textures, and unsuccessful decision regarding the level design in certain scenes, which in my opinion cannot be interesting in any way. Despite all my bias, it is worth nothing that overall I was genuinely interested in exploring this prototype. There's a certain charms in noticing various things and pointing out certain decisions like, oh, they haven't finished this facet yet at this stage, or oh, they completely covered this level in the textures and turned it into bonus content, removing the weasel trap concepts. It's cool and really adds a vibe to the explorations. I truly enjoyed conducting this overview analysis, and I hope you found it interesting to watch. And in conclusion, I wanted to make a certain observation regarding prototypes, not only of Manhunt, but also of beta version and working builds of games in general. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that GSC Game World Studios also fell victim to hacker attack and data breaches. As a result, many people had the opportunity to see the technical state of Stalker 2 at the time of the leaked confidential information. Furthermore, some bloggers like Oldboy or Igor Linka, who had the chance to play Stalker 2 prototype at specialized gaming exhibitions, noted that the game was still quite raw.
В розрізі грання короткого шматка гри менше, ніж на годину загального часу, а тому судити по ньому, наскільки буде класна гра загалом, неможливо.
И в принципе это видно даже из трейлера. Вы посмотрите на эти корни, они как будто бы из игры про Гарри Поттера 2002 года выпуска. И
keep in mind that this was a prototype presented to the public more than half a year ago. And think about how much time has passed already and how much time it's still ahead. Take that into account. So, what I'm trying to say is that comparing the levels and scales of development of these games is not entirely fair. However, consider that this working prototype of Manhunt was created half a year before the official release of the game, and remember how Manhunt turned out after that half year. Therefore, I believe that any conclusions about the final result of a game made based on its prototype seems somewhat short-sighted. As we have seen today, even within half a year of development, many things in the game prototype can be changed and improved, provided of course that the developers are an experienced and/or purpose-driven team. And thank you for watching. Anti-Mother out.